want to be up on the Elizabeth. If you would like to not be up on the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation's YouTube page, feel free to turn off your video if that's more comfortable for you. So I hope that you are all well. I'm so happy to have you here tonight. I'm even happier to have Katie Standefer with us, and she's going to talk about her book, Lightening Flowers. I first heard about Katie's work and heard her speak in our mutual friend Anne Randolph. Anne has been my writing, well, I don't even want to say this anymore because how long can you be somebody's writing teacher if they don't write really anything? But she's been mine for about 12 years. I've been her most frustrating student ever. But she brings in master teachers sometimes, and Katie was one of those teachers. And her conversation around navigating illness, her having to develop a relationship with death at a very young age, and then writing this book and figuring out sort of the cost of having all these wonderful medical device that saves your life. And she'll talk at length about that. So Pam is saying that you can see everything, but you cannot hear me. I would suggest, can everybody else hear me? You could just, yes, turn up the volume on your computer. That's where I would start. And if you use headsets with your computer, maybe unplug those or switch the audio on the little microphone picture. If you click that up arrow next to it on the right, we'll say select microphone, and make sure that the microphone you are selecting. And if none of those work, go out and come back in, just like hitting the TV really hard. That sometimes actually will fix it. So for those of you who are new, I welcome you. And I'm also usually begin with a little bit of just a brief introduction to the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation. My name is Susan Barber. I am working with the foundation just to curate and put together some community education programming. We usually have a once a month community conversation. We have a death cafe that in September will go to twice a month on the second and fourth Tuesdays at 10 a.m. Our community conversations are usually the first Tuesdays at 10 a.m. And then we have an author or a movie, but we've mostly been hearing from authors. And that is usually the fourth Thursday of the month, though this kind of stuff changes around depending on availability. So without further ado, the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation is a 501c3 not-for-profit organization that was inspired by Elisabeth's life. Elisabeth was a psychiatrist, doctor, humanitarian, and a hospice pioneer. The foundation was begun 1 year after Elisabeth's death by her son, Ken Ross, who still is the president of the foundation and runs it, the day-to-day operations. Over the course of the last 15 years, chapters for the foundation have been created on 4 continents, maybe 5 now, and they continue her mission to develop hospice, palliative care, and grief support opportunities for people around the globe. In 2019, most of Elisabeth's archives were donated to Stanford University, and they're creating a digital library to make her papers available to the public. And though Elisabeth was known as the death and dying lady, what Elisabeth was most focused on was life and living, and encouraged everybody to live their life to the fullest, and hoped that by spending time contemplating death, thinking about death, and being with death, that people would really have an opportunity to live their life to the fullest. So there's no regrets when they arrive on their deathbed. And with that said, I want to introduce Katie. Here we go. Katie is the author of Lightening Flowers, My Journey to Uncover the Cost of Saving a Life. This book was a finalist for the 2021 Kirkus Prize in Nonfiction, selected as a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice staff pick, and shortlisted for the J. Anthony Lucas Work in Progress Prize from Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. Lightning Flowers was featured on NPR's Fresh Air and named one of Oprah Magazine's best books for the fall of 2020. Katie's previous writing appeared in the Best American Essays of 2016. She's earned her MFA at the University of Arizona and was a 2018 Logan Nonfiction Fellow at the Carey Institute for Global Good. And Katie is in a transition herself. She is just moving from a beloved place to another beloved place where she will get to live with bears. So Katie, with that introduction, and that will, then you can continue to practice your relationship with death on a daily basis.
You just stole my segue.
Oh, no. Okay, well, let's
That's
pretend
so
I
funny.
didn't say that. I'm going to put
Great
Katie
minds.
here in this
Great minds.
here, and also want to just make sure that everybody, Pam, I hope that you're able to hear now. Pam, are you able to hear us now? I guess not, because you are not responding at all. Let's see when Katie starts speaking, and I will mute myself now, Katie. I'll remove.
Okay, it looks like Susan is muted. Thanks, folks, for joining us. I'm coming to you from Arlington Heights, Illinois, at my childhood library. I happen to be staying with my parents right now in Chicagoland, in the middle of a little bit of a paperback tour that is horribly timed because apparently Midwesterners all go on vacation the last week of July. So it's really nice to be here with you and see actual faces on the screen joining us. And feel free, I'll try to keep a little bit of an eye on the chat, although I know we'll have some time for questions at the end too. So my book, it's called Lightning Flowers. It tells the story of my troubled relationship to my own implanted cardiac defibrillator. When I was 24 years old, I was working as a ski instructor and a climbing guide in Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And one day I randomly went into cardiac arrest in a parking lot. I was at band practice. I had my cell phone ring and I ran outside to take the call. And then I woke up several minutes later with gravel in my forehead. And I don't know what brings you to the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation, whether it was your own death experience in your body or a loved one's near death or death experience. But the story that I've lived over the last 13 years that feels like it's moving to a new chapter in a very interesting way because I am finally moving back to that place where it first occurred. It has really been a walk with death. And I didn't understand that that was going to be the transformation that I was living at the time. I only knew I was terrified. So what I want to do is share a little bit about what this journey has been for me, hopefully in ways that keep lighting things up for you about your own relationship to death or the folks who are in your lives. My story begins in 2009, and in the book, it goes through about 2017, although I'm happy to talk further about where I am now. Lightning Flowers actually opens by talking about my younger sister. So inevitably, like most of us, not everyone is born with the same level of able-bodied privilege, but many of us are sort of born from a place where we get to experience a little bit of naivete about death. And my younger sister actually started going into cardiac arrest before me. We share a genetic arrhythmia called long QT syndrome. It's a problem in the way electricity is conducted in the heart due to some of the minerals, and it can cause the heart to quiver instead of pump blood. So it's not a physical, like plumbing or material challenge with the heart. It's just the minerals that conduct electricity. And it doesn't happen all the time. We have something called type 2 long QT syndrome. Type 1 tends to have to do with exercise. Type 3 tends to have to do with sleep cycles. And in type 2, we tend to be triggered by the startle response, the adrenaline response in the body. And long QT most often presents in young adults and more often in women than men because androgen is a protective factor. So you may see male athletes in their early teens, especially before the androgen hits a certain level, collapsing on the field due to long QT syndrome. And you do sometimes see older males, as their androgen levels drop, they may have a little bit more happen with their long QT if they've just been kind of a carrier all their lives. That's not to say that some males don't have breakthrough long QT syndrome, but there's kind of this archetype of the young adult, late teen through mid 20s. That's really when it shows itself. The good news about long QT syndrome is it's something that if you know you have it, you can really make choices that take a lot of the risk out. So we have a giant list of medications to avoid. Obviously, cardiac defibrillators can be implanted prophylactically, when it's appropriate. My book talks a lot about why that's not always actually as simple an answer as we sometimes think it is. But as science has progressed, we've really been able to learn a lot about how this operates genetically and how we can work with it. And so as long as you know you have it, there's a lot you can do. There's a little tiny section in the middle of the book where I talk about my great-great-grandmother, who was named Lena Proctor, and she lived in Hamilton, Texas, and died in 1899, which was a year before the EKG was invented. And so we didn't even know the difference between a heart attack and cardiac arrest back then. And she died at age 20. She was 5 months postpartum, which is a period of particular risk for those of us with type 2 long QT syndrome. You can imagine, both because of fluctuating hormone levels, and also because there's a lot of startling sounds in the night for new parents. So Lena Proctor died at age 20, and there was no way of knowing that she was a part of the same story. She only had one son because she died so young. He actually only had one child who was also a son, which was my grandfather. And my grandfather had 4 boys, one of whom was my father, obviously a carrier. No idea. My uncle also has turned out to have long QT syndrome, now that we know. My dad had 3 daughters, and 2 of the 3 of us ended up with long QT syndrome. So that kind of brings it all the way back around to my younger sister at the beginning of Lightning Flowers, who begins going into cardiac arrest in her dorm room. And her roommate has no idea what's happening. Her roommate's alarm clock would go off, and Christine would sometimes be in the process of getting up in the morning and just drop. And, you know, they would call the EMTs, couldn't figure out, was it seizures? Yeah, of course, as a freshman in college, my parents were like, were you drunk? not to make light of it, but we were really just not even thinking in the right direction for a while. So, you know, my initial relationship to death was getting this call and hearing that this was happening to my sister and having it be very far away. It was very not real. I lived about 500 miles away at the time. She was down in Boulder. I'm up in Jackson Hole. And although I cried for her, I was the family member who never went in to get an EKG. At the time I was insured, but within the year I would allow that insurance to lapse. I was, you know, in my early 20s. I didn't have a lot of money, working in outdoor education, trying to be a writer. And it just felt stupid to pay for those catastrophic policies. Pretty much breaking my leg skiing was the only thing I was worried about, which is a privileged situation to be in. And so the day that I went down in that parking lot, when I woke up, I knew exactly what it was. And I think one of the things that I've really admitted since then is some part of me understood that if anyone else in the family had this syndrome, it was going to be me. And I had some weird symptoms, waking up in the night with my heart pounding, one time on a treadmill, feeling my heart almost beat out of my body was how it felt, just way out of proportion with how I was running. And it freaked me out. But when you are assured of your own able-bodiedness, you just assume bodies are weird and you'll probably be fine. It's just a weird thing. So when I woke up that day, the first thing I said, when my guitarist didn't notice that I was missing for a while. I lay there and I didn't know who I was or where I was. I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. And then slowly my ability to speak came back. And as my voice got stronger, I was able to call for my guitarist, and he ran out and called my boyfriend, who came over. And the first thing I said to my boyfriend was, you can't take me to the hospital because I'm uninsured. I'll never be able to get insurance again. The year was 2009. And so what really began there for me in this initial period was 5 months where I knew I had long QT syndrome. I was uninsured. The way the American healthcare system worked at the time, that meant I had a pre-existing condition. That meant I couldn't get care. I couldn't get insurance. Anyway, I could pay out of pocket for care. And I did go pay out of pocket to go to a cardiologist. I got on beta blocker medications, which were not a great fit for me. And I had this extended period of time where anytime I stood up, I felt like I was going to pass out. And I thought, is it the medication or is it my heart condition? And so it kept me from running. It kept me from hiking. Just getting out of bed in the morning was a crazy experience. Sexuality was crazy. And I was only 24 years old. And I almost fell off my bike in traffic one time and had to call my boyfriend to come get me. And so the passage I'm going to read to you first from Lightning Flowers is about this period where I'm trying to proceed with my life, but I'm aware of death every minute and living in this kind of alternate reality where none of the other young people around me are living that same experience. My boyfriend and I were so freaked out that if he went to the store, he would make me call someone so that if I dropped, someone would know that I was no longer on the line. And I was on beta blocker medication. So in terms of medical standards, I was relatively safe, but I did not feel safety. And I think probably a lot of us can resonate with that first period of recognizing that to be human, to be alive, is to be in constant danger of death, which, we'll talk about some of the ways that got more textured for me as the experience went on. So this is from I think chapter 2, very close to the beginning of the book. How was a person to live if she were simultaneously fine and in danger every moment? In the weeks that followed, I spent hours on the phone with Sam's friends who were doctors, trying to understand. I connected with an organization called the Sudden Arrhythmia Death Syndromes Foundation, SADS, and their staff spent whole afternoons thinking through my situation, trying to pin down what we did and didn't know about long QT syndrome and how it related to exercise. From what I could parse, physical exertion itself is really dangerous for those of us with type 2. Exercise is type 1's trigger. Yet many type 2 kids are diagnosed and then yanked from their sports teams as a precaution. That type 2's QT interval lengthens based on an adrenaline response means that certain parts of physical activity might be more dangerous than others. The burst of a sprint, the surprise of someone coming from behind for the ball. But beneath all my questions lay a bare medical answer. No one knew yet. In 2009, we didn't yet have longitudinal studies examining how people's activity levels translated to cardiac events. Long QT syndrome is believed to be rare, affecting in about 1 in 7,000 people, although it is thought that many remain undiagnosed. According to the National Heart, Lung, and Blood Institute, as many as 3,000 to 4,000 children and young adults die every year of long QT syndrome. Organizations such as SADS work to get out in front of this, helping people recognize warning faints, supporting efforts to place automatic external defibrillators, AEDs, beside playing fields, encouraging the screening of young athletes using EKGs, and creating a pool of people who could turn to each other for help. But there was a long way to go. No one could give me an answer. To take groups hiking into the backcountry as my job, it went without saying, was unacceptable. Whether or not the physical exercise put me at risk, I would be miles from the nearest medical facility if, say, I were startled by a bear, the kind of thing that happened from time to time in this line of work. Lead that summer weren't backpacking, I rationalized. We would never be, say, 30 miles from a trailhead, hauling pots and tents towards some high tarn. My clients stayed in high-end hotels in town and ate at restaurants with elk heads mounted to the walls. During our hikes, my co-leader and I carried only first aid kits, tablecloths, chicken salad, and fresh chocolate chip cookies on our backs. Yet we did drive to remote trailheads up on the divide, hike 10 miles at a stretch, tackle steep paths red with mud. I had been doing this work long enough to know that we managed risk every time we went out. The beta blockers, once they built up in my system, left me dizzy and short of breath, keeping my heart rate artificially low even when my body needed more oxygen. As I hiked in front of my clients, I was often close to passing out, watching my edge. I tried to stay fast enough to be professional, to keep a lead on those knobby-kneed old men in beige jungle shirts, who'd spent their retirements doing nothing but hiking. But I was always scared. I never knew if the sensations I felt in my chest were the heart condition itself or the medication, was never sure if I was in danger. As we hiked deep into the forest, I swallowed down anger as my clients, mostly older and wealthy, often conservative, weighed in on the healthcare debates, usually on the side of politicians whose plans would have left me without care for the foreseeable future. And so death stalked me for the first time that summer, arriving with its hot breath on the back of my neck. I went running out on the National Elk Refuge Road and found myself sitting at its edge, spinning, looking out at the long dry grasses that gleamed with silver in the wind. I woke in the morning with death sitting heavy on my chest, a fatigue clouding my eyes, and could not forget it. One day I had to call Sam from a strip of grass not far from the library, where I'd hopped off my bike, dizzy and palpitating, afraid I'd topple forward into traffic. He loaded the bike into his Jeep with the sort of sad silence I have come to know as part of illness in general, but especially for those who are young and sick, those from whom something is being taken that they did not yet realize they had. What gave me pleasure in life was hopping on my bike to streak downtown. What managed my moods was intense exercise. What made me feel like me was to move through the wild. I didn't understand, actually, what the alternative to doing these things was. I saw a life full of nothing. I saw a person who wasn't me. I kept thinking, my sister almost died in bed all of those times. However much I might twist my life into one of caution and stillness, avoiding everything, it could be someone's ringing cell phone, the siren of a passing ambulance. I hadn't been hiking in the backcountry when I passed out in that parking lot. I had taken a call. If death wanted to find me, there was no stopping it. Maybe in this, the Salt Lake City cardiologist was right. Nothing was safe. So the way that story moves forward is that this reaction to the beta blocker medication is intense enough, in particular, the way it gets in the way of my having a sex life as a 24-year-old, it was unacceptable to me. And so I ended up going down to Boulder to see my sister's cardiologist as a second opinion, to try to figure out, like, could I actually be on less of this medication? Do I actually need an ICD? Like, can you help make sure I actually understand where I'm in danger and where I'm safe? That question of, like, where is the safety was really, really key to me at the time. The first cardiologist I'd seen, who I didn't talk about yet, he was in Salt Lake City. And he basically treated me the same as patients who were closer to the end of their lives than the beginning, and wouldn't talk to me at all about the fact that I led hiking trips for a living. What he said to me was, you should probably never swim again. And he said, tennis and light golf might be nice. And so I just felt like we hadn't actually even had the conversation about what this diagnosis meant in my life. And I went to see my sister's doctor really to have the conversation. I think I could tell there was a lot that wasn't integrating. And now looking back, it's like that period seemed so long between the first visit and the later one. And it was actually only a few weeks. So this period really shifted, this period of living in relationship to death for the first time, feeling its presence all the time. It really shifted when this second cardiologist told me that he thought I should have an ICD. He basically looked at my strips from the hospital, came to a different conclusion about the likelihood that the arrhythmia was dangerous for me. And he told me I needed to make my arrangements, which, if you're uninsured, is very complicated, particularly if you live in a rural area where you don't have a local hospital who does procedures, heart procedures, because I couldn't get a discount as a local. I couldn't get financial aid anywhere. I was going to end up paying fully out of pocket. And at the time it was about 180 grand estimated. So what we ended up doing was I quit my life in Jackson and I moved to Boulder, where my sister's surgeon said he would donate his fee. And he ended up donating, getting the anesthesiologist to donate his fee. He got St. Jude Medical to donate a defibrillator, and the hospital ended up kicking in, I think, $84,000. I became a resident before I ended up in the ER. So it was really a wild experience. And this was a real turning point for me because I assumed that having a defibrillator now meant I couldn't die. And I went through this experience of becoming a different self who had lived through certain pain, and my body physically incorporating this cyborg metal object into itself. For those of you who don't know ICDs well, it's the cousin of the pacemaker. It's a little bit bigger than a pacemaker. The battery needs to be larger because there's more electricity generated. Generally, it's more like the paddles in the ER, intended to really restart the heart. So it's a little box, right, like this, and it's connected down my vein, screwed into the heart in a couple places so that it can accurately sense and deliver electricity. So it was such a shift to absorb that device and to go through being someone who had lived that experience alongside my partner who had not lived that experience. So I really experienced in this book the shifts that come with knowing death as a 24-year-old when my 27-year-old partner kind of was not paying attention, I think intentionally, because he couldn't handle it. He didn't have the capacity for it yet. His life hadn't prepared him in any way for that moment of potential caretaking. And so it was then a pretty horrible day when I went septic about 6 months after my initial implantation, theoretically unconnected from my implantation. We didn't ever find bacteria on my heart or on the device, so that's good. But it was very mysterious why an otherwise healthy 24-year-old suddenly began rotting alive from group B strep, the bacteria that is often found in the digestive tract or in women's vaginas. That's where I believe mine was. I think I had a micro tear probably during sex, and this bacteria entered my bloodstream. And after the year that I'd had, my body just wasn't strong in the normal ways that we expect the immune system of many young people to be. And so I really entered this otherworldly experience of the disorientation and hallucinations and just extreme pain of sepsis over the course of about 10 days. And so what I'll read next is from this section. I actually was discharged from the hospital twice. The first time they couldn't give me an answer, and I came back in the next day very emergently. The second time I was discharged, they had me on IV antibiotics. They thought the infection was stabilized, but I had gotten pneumonia when I was unable to breathe because the pain in my head from the infection was so intense. And in the midst of that pneumonia, one of my feet got very large. And so there were concerns about a blood clot. And so I'm going to share from a night that in that third little hospital stay where my relationship to death really changed significantly. In mid-afternoon, a pharmacist appeared in the doorway and began explaining a new drug. "Wait, what?" I said. A stack of papers fluttered in her hand. She looked uncomfortable. "Coumadin," she said. "It's a more powerful anticoagulant than the heparin shots you've been getting in your belly. The hospitalist prescribed it to break up the clot in your lung, to prevent more." No one said anything, so she continued. "You'll need to come back to the hospital weekly," she said, "for 6 months. My breath caught. 6 months? You'll need to avoid vitamin K, leafy greens. It's the antidote to this medication. It causes it not to work. Kale is a big problem. It's farmer's market season," I said. The pharmacist smiled tightly, shifted. "Well, it's not that you can't have any," she said. "You just have to have the same amount every week so your dosage works. You have to be really careful." She lifted a few papers. "I have some handouts for you if you want them. You'll have to watch your activity level. Coumadin induces hemophilia. You'll want to avoid activities where you might fall down or get scratched. A wound may keep bleeding because of the blood thinner." "And what if I don't want this?" I said. Panic was welling up, metallic in my mouth, and I wished I could breathe deeply. "Well, it's been prescribed," she said lamely. "The hospitalists have determined that it's essential to your safety." I was working to control myself when she said, "You've already had your first dose." "What?" A nurse administered Without telling me what it was, I said. The tears were coming hard and fast. Rage. Then I remembered. The nurse who earlier had come around the side of the bed and jabbed me in the stomach with a needle, the way they did when they administered heparin. Except this woman had said nothing. No hello, no warning. It must have been a different drug. It's medically necessary, the pharmacist said again. Out, I said. I could barely get the words out. I was crying so hard, each gulp rippling against my chest like a hot poker. Katie, my dad said. I am 24 years old, I gasped, and I am not going to the hospital every fucking week. Do you need some? Out, I said. Everybody out. In the quiet after the door clicked shut, I watched the aspen out the window, blurred by tears, shifting in the breeze in its sorry little pen. Every part of me felt hot and sharp. I was just then hitting the 6-month mark on my lead wire. The greatest risk, I'd thought, had passed. I'd imagined I could begin my return to things. I could stop living in fear. But if I were on Coumadin, I'd have to start over. 6 months as a hemophiliac, worrying about falling or getting scratched. I wouldn't be free of this place even after I left. I knew then that I would die young. Something had collapsed in me those weeks, a belief in the privilege youth had once afforded, this sense that I could carry on living and be generally left alone. I had almost rotted alive for reasons no one seemed to understand. I had gone into cardiac arrest in a parking lot. I'd had microelectronics implanted in my body solely to make death go away, but there it was still, and there it would always be. It had always been there. I just hadn't seen it. The ICD seemed now grotesque, an absurd idea. All that effort only to rot in the ground anyway. Out the window, dark clouds churned over Mount Sanitas, one of those big spring storms that sweep down the Front Range and out over the plains. After the rain would come sun, and after the sun would come kale. And I wanted to be browsing the farmer's market, shoving greens into my mouth, then going for raucous runs on the mountainside. I wanted it, even if it meant I would die. It was, I realized, what it meant to be alive. So it's an interesting moment for me to read now. I'm 37. I never thought I'd live to be this old. I stopped wearing sunscreen in my 20s after this moment because I really felt like, well, I hate sunscreen and I'm gonna die in the near future. And what does it look like to really not assume that you're gonna be around? How does it change the way you make decisions? But I was like conscious of that shift in a few ways, and I wasn't conscious of it a lot of the time. And it was only about a year after that experience that I ended up quitting the job in public health that I'd gotten in Boulder and going to grad school to pursue my MFA. I had always known from the time I was a kid, and this is, it's a little bit of the book, but it's less in the book than it is actually in my life. I'd always known I was going to be a writer, and the whole reason that I didn't have insurance at the beginning of this chronicle is that I was trying to live this life that wasn't locked into a normal job so that I could write as much as possible and move toward that goal. I understood it to be the purpose of me. I understood that that was my soul's work on this planet, and that anything else was kind of a distraction and certainly didn't feel alive. And I think after what happened in sepsis, I had a much lower tolerance for anything that wasn't fitting into that sense of, is this the right use of me? So very quickly, I quit the job and I went off to grad school. I went through a long process of applying and getting in and choosing, obviously, that I don't talk about that much in the book. And this uneasy tension of, I have a defibrillator in my body and I recognize that it doesn't mean I won't die. That sort of just sat as an existing part of who I was subconsciously until this day in November of 2012 that forms the prologue of the book, when I was playing intramural soccer on a grad school team and my device began going off. And I very quickly, it took me a moment to understand what was happening to me. I heard screaming and I didn't know it was me, and my hands were curling from the electricity. And then I heard my sister's voice say, "There's no way you wouldn't scream if you felt it." And I was like, oh my God, it's happening. And then there was a pause, and then it happened again. And I very quickly realized something was wrong, because when this device goes off, you should be dead, right? You should be in cardiac arrest. You should be on the ground. It should be resuscitating you. And so I had this suspicion that something was wrong. And in total, it shocked me 3 times. A voice in my head, some critical intelligence said, "You can either scream or breathe." And I started doing yoga breathing. And what had happened was that the software in the device had different boxes checked for when it should shock me. And the box that was checked was "if any" instead of "if all." And that "if any" is if any criteria are met versus if all criteria are met. And one of the criteria was my heart being above 170 minutes for 170 beats per minute for 3 minutes or more. And that was a cumulative read. So I was kind of out of shape. I was sprinting after the ball, and I had a normal high heart rate, and it added up in the device and told the device that it was time to shock me. But those shocks weren't going to bring my heart rate back down, because the heart rate was actually a response to my overall exertion. And so it was just going to keep shocking me. And luckily that deep breathing brought it down. But as I lay on the field afterward, smelling my own burned tissues, I had this very strange thought, which was, what if the metal in my body came from an area with conflict minerals? What if children had to work in dark, horrible mine shafts to get this metal? What if women were kept as sex slaves? What if it perpetuated, the money was used to perpetuate conflict in an area? I think I had been paying attention to news out of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, which 2012 was one of the worst years for violence related to mining there. It was considered the rape capital of the world. And for some reason, this is what came through. And so in this traumatic moment, I really got obsessed with this question of, what is it that's in my body? And do I actually need it? At that point, it had been 3 years and it had never gone off. It had never saved my life. And now here it was, shocking me unnecessarily. It now felt like a predator inside me. It felt like it could go off at any time, like it might kill me as easily as save me, which, I think doctors would mostly say an ICD is not going to directly kill someone, but you can talk about studies of damage done to the heart from repeated shocks. And there certainly are a lot of studies about the mental health impacts of these accidental shocks, and cardiac patients actually committing suicide in the wake of storms of shocks like I experienced. In one study, the mean number of shocks that someone experienced was 17. There are a lot of people with very unstable hearts where the device can start shocking and shocking and shocking them, trying to help. I mean, it is helping, it's keeping them alive, but the shocks themselves are horrifying experiences. And so I got very interested in some of the tensions of this medical technology. Like, what does it mean for something to be life-saving? And is something still life-saving if it causes loss of life, or creates difficulties in a life, or tears apart an ecosystem on the other side of the world? If it does save my life, is my life worth all that? I really started reckoning with, okay, so we've saved my life in some regard, but I'm going to die anyway. And I just got in this soup of questions. And so about half of my book is the journey that I took to mines in Rwanda and also Madagascar. And, I read about mines from all over the world and really was trying to work on this project. And it was a very, very complicated way to try to ask the question, because ultimately no reckoning with human rights violations and environmental resource issues can tell you why your life matters. There's no, I shouldn't say there's no book for that, because I happen to have some books that have really helped me understand more about what it means that I'm still here, or to give me faith in the process of being here. Obviously, Viktor Frankl, more than anyone, Yes to Life is a book that I read last spring that I think about often. But it really, in all the days that I was walking back to remote villages in Madagascar to talk to people about the way a brand new nickel and cobalt mine had impacted their ability to go into their ancestral forest, that I sort of carried that question with me. I had nickel in my microelectronics and cobalt in my battery. And the thing that ultimately made my relationship to the defibrillator even more complex was when the device started breaking down inside me. So in February of 2016, I was on a flight to go on spring break with a friend, and I felt this very strange buzzing and kind of looked around like, is it the plane? What's happening? And then I realized it was my device vibrating inside me, sort of like a cell phone going off in your breast. It was totally weird. And that's how the devices let you know that you only have 3 months of battery left. So my device had lasted about 6.5 years, and it was alerting me that it was time. And it went off, it sort of buzzes 3 times, and then it waits 10 hours, and then it does it again. And it did it 4 cycles in full. And so by the time it gave off its last cycle, my friend and I were in a foreign country, and I was suddenly having to figure out a brand new primary care doctor and a cardiologist, because I had just, the Affordable Care Act had by then been passed, and I had just earned too much to be a part of the Medicaid expansion, and I was going to be on the very lowest tier of the subsidies on the healthcare marketplace. And none of the providers who I'd been seeing in Tucson were covered by that next tier. There was only one insurer on the marketplace, and so I needed to totally start over, get a new PCP, then get a new cardiologist, and then have this heart surgery all within 3 months. And I expected there to be this moment of pause of like, well, am I going to do this? Because I know I'm going to die anyway. So am I going to get another device that has all this ecological cost attached to it? And the answer in my body was yes, which kind of stunned me. And I also trusted it, because by then I'd really learned to listen to my body. And so I went through this process in the cardiac cath lab. The day of my procedure, the nurse sat me down and she said, "You are a car. We open the hood. We take out the battery. We put in a new battery. We close up the hood." And I looked at her and I said, "I am a human." And she was kind of like, she didn't really like that. But I said, things happen. Like, please don't pretend that there's no potential for things to go wrong in a procedure like this, because boy, I have not lived the life where things just medically go the easy way. And sure enough, I woke up from that procedure and they had an X-ray up in front of me, and they had discovered while they were replacing the device that my wire had gotten caught between my clavicle and first rib at some point, and it was actually fractured. And the scar tissue had been holding it in place, the scar tissue around the lead wire. But once they were moving it and trying to replug in a new wire, or not a new wire, a new device, they ran a test at the end of the procedure, and it didn't properly discharge into my heart. It didn't correct the arrhythmia that they had stimulated. And so they knew that they didn't have a functioning ICD system inside me. And this fracture meant I would need, if I wanted to continue with having an ICD, I would need a new wire placed. And I also had this question of, do you leave this broken wire in the body and just tie it off, or do you try to remove it? And this created a lot of terror for me, because in sepsis, bacteria will make a fort out of foreign objects in the body. So those of you who know sepsis know often pacemakers have to come out, ICDs have to come out, other technologies, because you just can't clear the infection if you have these foreign bodies that they can hang on to. And so I understood, sepsis remains today really my biggest fear. The feeling that I had of rotting alive, I can never forget. And knowing that if I have this broken wire inside me, it would have to come out in that kind of crisis. I also knew that every single day wires grow further into the heart, that it's never going to be easier to take out than it is today. The body is always covering things and folding things in. And so I ended up deciding, okay, when you put in the new system, let's do the lead extraction procedure. And I took a series of weeks to really, really stress out about this. And read a bunch of white papers. And part of why I did it was because I thought there was going to be a particular specialist doing it who didn't end up doing it, which plays into my story in a moment. But I'm just going to read you a couple passages from this period of preparing for the lead extraction surgery in Tucson in 2016. Now the heat of the summer came to Tucson, the flare of sun that would cook the desert brown. I walked up and down the block, gathering strength. I read academic paper after academic paper. It turned out all roads lead to death. I could avoid the risk of the procedure by not having it, but then I would have to live with the question of whether to put a second wire into the heart beside the abandoned first. Or I could avoid the risks of all this imperfect technology by simply opting out, by leaving quiet the broken lead and in my heart, by having the potentially broken defibrillator in my chest turned off and abandoned, by finally calling it and giving in to the risks of long QT. The death I felt courting me then at nearly 31 was gentler and quieter than the death I'd come to know at 24. It felt like a language I had come to speak, if not an old friend, then at least a presence I understood how to dance with. My body was only the size that it was, small in the world. I could die on the operating table or in a parking lot. I could die crossing the street in Tucson or in a traffic accident in some African city. Or I could die in 60 years, striped from the incisions of new defibrillators, my skin ratty from fluoroscopy, my endocardium pebbled with scar tissue from parades of lead wires. I was afraid, but not as afraid as I used to be. All things were dangerous, which meant none of them were. I would do the lead extraction now while I was young and strong. 2 nights before my lead extraction surgery, I went for a walk that was intended to be a block but turned into a mile, wandering the wide gravel streets as the darkness came down. I pressed my face into the night blooms of the oleander, sharp white in the dim light. The air was silk. Down near the elementary school, I sighted a lump along the telephone wire, something quavery that at first looked like a cat preening, but so high off the ground. Once I was underneath it, I knew, an owl. I circled from all sides, trying to be sure, startled that it hadn't flown off. Then I sat before it for a long time, watching a bright fingernail of moon go down behind it. The twin pyramids of ears were visible in that light. It was a great horned. An owl sighting means death. This much I remembered, although from where I could not say. Owls visit those who are dying, but not always in the physical sense. Death in the spiritual realm always means the sloughing, change that comes with force, the way a life turns over into something else. Owls draw attention to timing. Owls have the particular gift of seeing in the dark, of using the tiny bit of light that is there. On the sidewalk before the owl, I said aloud, "Let me see your eyes." Minutes of silence, the neighborhood deep blue, the stars arriving overhead. Then one car swung toward us from the south, headlights bright, wheels skidding over some gravel on the road. The owl at the last minute swiveled her face. After so much murkiness, hot orange eyes, powerful and terrible, trained on me. The owl swept off the wire, landed on the ground 10 feet before me. I walked backward down the block, eyes fastened on her as long as I could keep them. And she lifted off the wire just as I turned the corner, a giant dark wingspan pivoting away. If illness forces us to be present, the threat of death bringing us abruptly, even non-consensually into the moment. I was grateful for it then. I touched my wet face and breathed in the smell of the desert. Forget the wreckage of the calendar and the bank account this month of surgeries had wrought. I was alive. unfortunately, that surgery also did not go as planned. And when I woke up, I learned that the wire they were trying to extract had snapped off inside me. I'm seeing some of your faces, which is appropriate. And in all of the tugging, so essentially, after it snapped up inside me, they had to open a femoral incision and try to go up from below to recover the wire and try to pull from below, which means pulling around the right angle of the tricuspid valve. So that was much harder and not successful. And in that pulling, the insulation jerked off part of the wire, and 3 metal strands that had previously been held together over time ended up spidering into a nest. So what a lot of the end of my book is about is this big medical fight that I go through when the Trump administration comes into the White House. There's a very real possibility that the Affordable Care Act will be repealed. I'm sure some of you remember that sort of back and forth that we had all spring with different plans being proposed. And I was terrified that I would be left with this broken wire in me and not have access to care anymore. And I had already been without care because of pre-existing conditions and the insurance market on the day I needed it. And I just needed to get this wire out of my heart. For me, it was this kind of final push against the terror of sepsis, because I was certain that if I didn't get it out now, sepsis would come and it would get me. And to talk about it now is so, I can feel how animal it was, but I ended up embroiled in this enormous process to get a out-of-network authorization from the cardiologist who snapped the wire, and his office was not good about it. The system was very broken. I did eventually make it to the Mayo Clinic, but it was a horrible process. And so one of the last sections that I'm going to read you here is from this process of preparing to go to the Mayo Clinic to have another lead extraction attempt. And so on the one hand, I'm preparing to face death again in this procedure. For those of you who aren't familiar with the procedure, because it involves tugging this wire out of the heart that has grown into the heart, there's a very real risk of tearing the heart. It's not an easy procedure. It's definitely a specialty. And a lot of this technology has primarily been used, again, in folks that are closer to the end of their life than the beginning. And so if they have to cap off wires, if they don't outlive their device, there's just a lot fewer complications than for those of us who are starting so young and having so many wires and having all these different things go wrong. And so the procedure contains the potential complication that you could wake up with your sternum split if they tug at the heart and it starts bleeding and they need to actually stanch that bleeding. And so I'm preparing to go to Mayo Clinic, and so I'm preparing to have this procedure again that terrifies me, but I'm also having this horrible time fighting for the procedure that could kill me. It was just very mind-bending, because in some way, it felt like my life had already ended, because the process of trying to get care in our system had so taken over my life that I wasn't getting to do anything I loved. So here's the section on that. By then I was brittle with despair. It had been a year that proved to me how little of our lives we actually control, that one could spend years at a time asserting her will without anything coming of it. One could receive medical treatment that was supposed to save her life, but instead endangered it. One could be hit by a car on a normal Saturday evening on the way home from a trailhead. One could begin a promising relationship and then never hear from him again. One could dial Congress every day and see the news becoming ever worse. One could waste entire days on the phone with insurance companies and hospitals without things ever being arranged. One could attempt to buy car after car and still end the day on a bike. One could spend so much time on all this that her career falls apart. The risk of the procedure, of death, loomed before me. Unlike the previous year, when the threat of death sharpened my resolve to do the things I loved, now the dull march toward death in a surgical theater rendered everything pointless. I was spending all my time fighting for something that carried a statistically significant risk of ending me, and so meaninglessness stretched out forward and behind. To live seemed suddenly a stupid sort of faith. a treadmill of activity without meaning or reward. It was as if a veil had suddenly pulled back before me. If the reasons we have for living are the things and people we love most, all of these too can be lost. A brutal end awaits our bodies, which we will lose in stages, and a brutal end awaits everyone we love, possible every moment. To say this has become a cliche, but to know it viscerally is something else altogether, a horror perhaps beyond any other. One cannot come to this place and not be changed by it. If all our efforts are for those who will become corpses, if the books we write will somewhere rot, the whole project of living is absurd. When one arrives in this place, one can either choose to live or not. We have to tell ourselves a story that makes living possible. God is one such story, that we live because a creator wants us to, because there is some master plan for us. Or we live for our children, whose lives somehow supersede ours in significance. I had neither kids nor God and wanted neither. I had no partner carrying a shared vision. I found myself dangerously unmoored, swaying in the hot winds of whatever phone calls unfolded that day, disconnected from anything that mattered except for my friends, showing up in their quiet ways, dropping me at medical appointments on the other side of town, or lending me their cars, or arriving at the beer bar with dinner to share on my break, listening always to the ranting, formless stories that had come to comprise my life. Living, naturally, is never easy, writes Albert Camus in The Myth of Sisyphus. You continue making the gestures commanded by existence for many reasons, the first of which is habit. Dying voluntarily implies that you have recognized, even instinctively, the ridiculous character of that habit, the absence of any profound reason for living, the insane character of that daily agitation, and the uselessness of suffering. If this story of a woman's pre-authorization feels laborious and a bit annoying, that's because it is. The bureaucracy of a pre-authorization is profoundly boring, except, of course, when it is connected to your very life. When you think, as I did, that this may be the last year in which you will have access to insurance, when you think it is your last chance to remove from your body an object of medical detritus you know will prove a problem on some distant day, and when you already know, as I did, exactly what it feels like to have no health insurance on the day something goes wrong. If the story of a pre-authorization seems like a lot of meaningless back and forth, it is, only it is a meaninglessness that becomes one's life. In such a battle with healthcare bureaucracy, the hours of meaninglessness grow tumorously, crowding out other uses of one's talents and time, wrecking some of the reasons to live, even as it is living one fights for. One becomes hypervigilant, waiting to dial the moment business hours open, tracking the last time one called, lest one later be blamed. One can throw at a problem all the hours she has and see no reward for her attempts. One can even be, as I was, college educated and deeply experienced in the insurance system, and still feel like Sisyphus, rolling a rock up a hill only to watch it roll back down. The system is not built to deliver care. It is built to maximize profit, not only by denying care, but by frustrating patients until they quit trying. The system is built not for patients, but for the profit engines of pharmaceutical companies, medical device manufacturers, and not-for-profit hospitals that set high prices to pay their executives millions. In the middle sit insurance companies trying to pay as little of these extraordinary costs as possible, protecting themselves from paying out their profits. They protect themselves not only at the price of our health, but at the price of our sanity. Not only had the defibrillator not saved my life with its shocks, not only had it gone from being a technology of promise to a flapping detritus bearing new complications, not only had it been forged at such ecological and social cost, now the process of trying to get appropriate care for what was stranded inside me had so ruined my quality of life that I wanted to be dead. If the causa finalis of a defibrillator is the need to prevent premature death in a young woman with a genetic condition, the ICD within this system is broken. So I know I'm approaching my hour here before we get into Q&A. And so just want to close these strands a little bit. It was hard to end this book as a writer because I actually hadn't had much time to live past it. The events in the book go up until June of 2017, and I sold the book in November 2017 on pitch. So I was trying to write it, a lot of it in 2018, 2019, and very early 2020. And it meant that I really had to wrestle with how unresolved a lot of these questions were. I came away with quite a lot of useful takeaways for various industries. I have a lot to say about the way the medical system could better support young people getting diagnoses where they need to recover a sense of safety. And I have a lot of ideas for defibrillator manufacturers on ways that we can differently design defibrillators. And there are a lot of amazing programs in process to figure out how to recycle and actually reuse these devices to kind of make more use of them for all of the resources that it took to originally forge them. But the piece that has been the most gaping has been, how do I continue to live a life that I thought was going to end a long time ago? And what does it mean to become so acquainted with the story of this trauma of having death right here, and also knowing that in order to live well, it's not that you should forget death necessarily, but it can't be right here all the time. There's some kind of dance here where you become able to have longer term priorities again. And this book was my whole purpose for a long time in surviving the events of the book. And so to finish it, to turn it in, to start putting it out in the world, to start talking about this relationship to death that I carry as a literal nest inside my heart, which makes me no different from any other human, right? Everyone on this call is also living in relationship to death at every moment. But there's this way that I was given a physical manifestation of that carrying that I needed to integrate and figure out. And so a lot of my work now that's not in the book will be moving forward into that question of returning to living. And so I'm interested if folks on the call have things to say about that, you're welcome to share as part of this next half hour.
Yeah, if anybody would like to share something, I will, and I'll also go through chat if people want to put up anything up here in the chat, and a question if you're not brave enough to raise your hand. And if you are brave enough to raise your hand, I just ask that people use the little icon down at the bottom. There's a reaction button. If you move your cursor down there, there's a smiley face. If you click reactions underneath all the little icons, there's one that says raise your hand. And that is the easiest way just for me to see people's reactions here, or what that somebody would like to say. And I believe there's something that it came to me, but I don't believe it's meant for me. It's from Rosa, and I'm going to bet that this is not meant for me. Rosa was one of our volunteers. She may still be at Mission Hospice, where I worked for many years. And she says, the challenges you have faced seem impossible to me. Yet here you are with the most inviting smiling face and the gift of putting your story with words. A true warrior on every level. You're an amazing writer. Thank you, Rosa. And
thank you, Rosa.
Katie, I'm curious about this, sort of the idea of warrior. We hear that quite a lot in relationship to people who have lived through their illness or are living with illness. And I'm curious about that, how that word lands for you, how that feels in terms of just your life.
Warriorship. That's a really compelling question, and thank you for that framing. Yeah, I think it's an interesting word. Maybe the reason I haven't had it come up in one of these conversations before is because I feel like it so often gets bandied around for things like cancer, right? Where we have this perceived enemy within us that could be pushed back against or eradicated in some way. And for me, long QT is certainly not something that you can do that with in the same way. There's not like a progressive way of monitoring or measuring it. And if anything, I feel like part of my impulse to survive has been becoming a warrior against my device in sometimes kind of an immature way. And so I think a lot of writing the book has been trying to integrate that huge spectrum of nuance that actually needs to exist within the way anyone practices medicine, or the way the system allows medicine to be practiced, where this is a truly amazing invention. Its nickname is the Lazarus device, and it has saved my sister's life. Her device did go off once and reverse cardiac arrest. And so I have that deep gratitude. And for me, I don't think it's too much of a spoiler, because reading the story is so different, to say that when I get to Mayo Clinic, they do tell me that I probably never should have had one implanted. Dr. Ackerman, who is the world's expert on my syndrome, said, the only thing that has been done wrong so far is everything that has been done so far. And so he really taps into this way that in our society, we're so afraid of death that we immediately reach for the most aggressive option. We warrior against death. And that's not a battle we're going to win. And so there's this very interesting tension where I think doctors think they're being conservative when it comes to young patients and defibrillators, but it's actually a very crazy thing to thread a wire down someone's vein and corkscrew it into their heart, and then to leave it for decades at a time. That's really a big intervention. And as the science around long QT has gotten better, we've been able to dial in more appropriately what are the different, not only different drugs, but titrations of drugs. There's actually a sympathetic denervation procedure that can happen, kind of like an ablation in a particular part of the heart, that helps a lot of patients. And that's invasive and has its own risks. But in general, the Mayo doctors that I saw considered it to be lower risk than having a defibrillator over the course of a life, with all these different parts that break and all of the issues of shocking and infection and just these burdens that aren't realized. And it really comes down to, are we trying to use technology to warrior against death itself? And what does it actually mean to think about some of the more sacred connotations of being a warrior, standing upright and facing things? And I do feel like these experiences have been particularly initiatory for me to try to be a warrior in the sense of holding some sacred line in our culture around not so much death's inevitability, but death's place in all things, and of late that has meant also being in relationship to sexuality as sort of a sacred piece of that. So yeah, I think I'm really grateful that you're talking about warriorship, because it's really like, what is it that we choose to fight against? What is it we choose to fight for? What are the ways that the archetype of the warrior held some kind of space that we needed held in previous cultures? And what space then can someone who's experienced illness and relationship to death try to be holding within themselves and the way they live their life?
That's yeah, I was thinking about this too. There's a couple of things that come to mind when I'm listening to you, and this the being involved with death and dying, and being witnessing many of my friends' deaths during the AIDS epidemic, which kind of really flipped my life. And after spending time for 4 or 5 years supporting some of my friends as they were dying, I wasn't like going back to the options market. That just didn't seem to make a lot of sense. So I went into working with hospice and training volunteers. But this idea, I was raised, and I certainly lived the first 30 years of my life with, like, death is this horrible mistake. It's a failing of some sort that happens way out here in the future. And these experiences have really taught me a lot about death is always here. It's always with me. And not in a morbid sense necessarily, but in a really true sense. If this is true, I live in an earthquake fault, at any moment. The reality is the earth could actually spin it. I lived through 89 when it did actually open up, where withstanding one day. So these kinds of experiences, I've come to really change the way I think about death. And I feel like really for me, my death, I hope, and I hope I'm in a place where this can be true, will be the culmination of all the things I've learned in my life. It's not going to be a mistake. It's going to be all of the things that I have learned and carried, and all of the teaching and the people that have supported me culminated into an experience that's a transition that I don't know anything about what happens next. I can guess, but I feel like this is not a mistake. I think we've really turned this whole idea around. And for me, it's just allowed me to engage in my life in a very different way, thinking about death in those terms.
Yes.
This is the ultimate teaching. I do all of this work in my life, and we're all going to get to that point. And then what is it that we can really, accomplish during the time we're dying? And that seems like sort of a convoluted question from somebody that's very well, maybe. But I also really hope that when I'm in the stages of my death, that this is also a question that I'm holding every day. Because I'm just so grateful to the people who let me in when they were dying and what I was able to learn from that experience. And I had this conversation with a gentleman who was incarcerated for many years, and he spent the last several years of his incarceration working in a prison hospice, and how that experience completely transformed his life and actually allowed him. He was able to get out on his sentence was commuted from the work he was doing. But just the tremendous transformative experience of being with people that are dying and not wasting that at all, to really to use that as somebody is ill or lives with that every day. I'm curious about how you hold death, sort of, just kind of how you relate. And then there's some questions that we will.
How do I live as though my death is not a mistake is such a beautiful question. And I just want to underline it. I wrote it down for myself because I think as you're talking, like, yes, you can be quite well. And that's not the same experience as having illness or death move through you. But I do think the deaths that you witnessed and were a part of, they're not over and they're still in you. There's something of that doesn't move on. And we were talking right before everyone joined us about how I recently lost my dearest animal friend, who was a chicken, and she was my main companion during the pandemic. And it was a really stunning experience. She was sick over 10 days, and there were days I expected to lose her and didn't. And then the morning I found her, I wasn't expecting it. And so it was kind of extra horrific to encounter the body. And I went through this very complex process over the next 3 days that now I am so grateful for, even though it was so hard, because in our society, we don't spend time with bodies in very personal ways. When my family dogs had died, they were sort of whisked away as soon as putting them down was over. And here I encountered this body, and then it was like, wow, that body is not going anywhere unless I am the one who moves it. And so then I have to get ready and become ready. And the grief was so intense at first that I couldn't approach this body. But over time, I was able to learn how to have the body both be her and not be her. And I could feel these different transitions I was going through as I moved the body in the freezer eventually. And I actually ended up going through a ritual of harvesting her wings and preserving them in the same way that Native American folks make eagle fans. I now have this wing fan desiccating, curing, mummifying, so that it will not be rotting. But going through the process of loving this bird and preparing her body and actually using a bone saw, and then loving this one part of her and loving this other part of her and burying part of it and preparing it for that. And just the length of the ritual and the way I was able to feel what of her was remaining at different moments in time, and also what of her death was present or not present. All of this is so much more rich and nuanced than we've been allowed to know. And I can't say enough how that question, how do I make my death not a mistake in the way that I'm living? I feel like that sense of integration, that sense of all these different things coming into one body. And it's not so much like the desperation of, I need to do something grand before I die. Although I think that can be an impulse that creates beautiful works, and it certainly created Lightning Flowers. But
So I'll go back, Katie. Thank you so much for that. Alina, I'm gonna have you go, since you have your hand up. I'm gonna bring you down here. And you can go ahead and unmute yourself, and then we'll come back to the chat. And you are still muted. Oh, that's 1 second. That's on me. Thank you. Of course, you were probably saying that, but I couldn't hear you. Okay, go ahead now. You should be able to unmute yourself. There you go.
Yes, it's working. So to Katie, I want to say that you are absolutely charming as you present to us all these profound topics like death and the healthcare system and making choices about devices in your body. And you are just the perfect person to bring us these issues. So I do have a question, but first I just wanted you to know how wonderful you are. So a lot of what you've been through, I'm able to relate to. I was told by a doctor that I would die and that I was dying, and I believed him. So then I had like death. I know what that's like. And then I know what it's like to go through the healthcare system and fight for this and make decisions. So that was 12 years ago. So, okay. So after about 3 years, exactly. So after about 3 years, I'm like, maybe that guy was wrong. Maybe it was wrong. And so, but still I had a, it's not a terminal illness, it's incurable. So you talked about cancers, that some cancers have a beginning and theoretically they have an end, and so what I have is incurable. So I have to live with this thing in my body. And so I was not willing to be a warrior for the rest of my life, but it was exhausting. And so I had to find a way, and the way that I found was to cohabitate with this disease in my body. And that changed this fear of death being in my face like this. It put it into a different place so that I still know that I'm going to die, because all of us are going to die, but it helped change that dynamic for me. The difference is that I was 68 and I'm now turning 80, and you were in your 20s. So that it had to be different for you than it was for me. But my question to you, dear Kate, is have you found a way to cohabitate with what's happening in your body and the possible I'm dying, I'm not dying, maybe I'm going to that. So have you found that way? And
thank you. Yeah, it's very interesting. I do not worry any longer about long QT syndrome. I have actually never had an arrhythmia come up since that day in the parking lot when I was 24. And so in terms of this question of how we live meaningful lives in the face of death, I understand, even though I'm also in an embodied way understanding of the fact that things could be over any time. I'm very aware that this is the purpose. This isn't my life getting hijacked. This is actually me being born into my purpose, that I had a life before, and now I have a life that began in 2009. I am, what does that make me, 12? 13, according to my second birthday. And so, there's such a joy that comes to me in hearing you tell me how charming or wonderful I am in a situation like this, because there are many ways that I struggle out in the world with, earning enough money. Should I get a like normal job? How would I even do that at this point? There's all of that, like not fitting, but where I fit is right here in this purpose. Like this is the language that I was exquisitely supposed to learn to speak. And writing books is what I am perfectly built for. And so there's a real dissonance for me that then makes my relationship to death feel more dramatic. But when I'm in that purpose, it doesn't matter so much what could be coming or what has happened to me, because it all feels like it's a part of a story that makes sense for me. And so I'm trying to sort of really feel that compass right now, of it's not about the could I die from the heart condition, certainly. And there's especially during COVID, I was very afraid of the way the virus might inflame my heart and creates, a lot of people were dying of pneumonia and sepsis. And with the wire in my heart, that was an issue. But I think for me, it's much more the dangerous daily death that happened in the healthcare battle of why is it meaningful to be alive if we all die? Why is it meaningful to be alive if everyone we love dies? Why is it meaningful to be alive if our planet is dying in front of us? And that can only, my life only works in the face of that when I'm most fully doing the thing that I'm supposed to be doing. So thank you to all of you for the gift of being in this space, having these conversations, because it makes everything so much more beautiful for me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you both.
Thank you.
So much. Somebody has asked if you could explain the title of the book.
Love it. Thank you. Lightning flowers is a term that refers to the thin branched burns that can cover the bodies of people who are struck by lightning. If you Google it, you'll see they are feathery, pink, rose-colored lightning bolts frozen onto the skin, and they're gorgeous, but they're burns. They're horrible. And, you know, when lightning strikes sand, you can end up with these long fused lightning bolts into the sand where things are melting together. And when I took those 3 shocks to the heart, I couldn't see what my insides looked like. I didn't know if I had burns from the way the electricity had moved through my body. I knew I had smelled my own burned tissues, and I knew I had seen my hands curl from the electricity. I knew that I was sore and a lot of muscles from that contraction the next day for several days. And I knew that I had been marked by it internally. And I knew that the way that I had been marked was both beautiful and horrific, kind of in the way we just talked about, that there's something in any other period of history to take that much electricity would have been a sign from the gods. It would have been a hand reaching down from the heavens. And if you survived the lightning bolt strike, it would mean something about you. There are a lot of cultures that have specific things that it means to be struck by lightning, especially multiple times. But because this is internal technological lightning, you know, the doctors who interfaced with me after that happened, they treated it like it was totally normal. They sort of waved me off as one who carried no wounds, I think is the phrase I use in the book. And so I really had to think, what does it mean to me spiritually to be struck by lightning internally? And what exactly is the way that I'm marked? And what is the way in which it's beautiful? And what is the way in which it's horrible?
Thank you for that. I'm going to read something that Rebecca put up here. She says, Katie, I'm appreciative and grateful for your honesty and for sharing your journey and dance with death. You're a skillful storyteller and writer. Thank you so much. And then Rosa asks, do you carry anger for the people who told you to have the defibrillator implanted? And then my question is, what would the consequence be if you decided now, I'm going to take this out and I'm going to work with the medications that are available, 12 years now later?
Yeah.
Just curious about both of those things.
Yeah, they're great questions. I don't have anger at the initial doctor who did tell me to have the device implanted, the one who donated his fee, because I understand that he just was where he was in the system, and we were where we were in the research. He thought he was saving my life. He had daughters, I think 2 daughters. And so he already knew my sister and saw that her arrhythmia had been resistant to treatment. She was already on a beta blocker medication when she had her successful shock and reversal of cardiac arrest. And that's a hard one in some ways because she wasn't on the medication that the research shows is best for type 2. So I still wonder, had she been on the right medication, would she have ever needed that shock? Still grateful it saved her life. But I think, you know, the way the condition exists within any one individual doesn't necessarily say anything about the way it exists in a family member. Part of what we're learning genetically is a person can have genes that their sister doesn't have that turn on or turn off this other gene that is causing the problem. I personally don't think my long QT would have ever acted up had I not been sexually assaulted about a year before I passed out in the parking lot, a year and a half, I guess. So I sort of had an energetic broken heart before I literally went down from this broken heart. And the stress that put my body through may have been this factor that kicked me over some edge. Maybe it would have happened anyway. But the question of why it has never happened since is very interesting to me. And so I understand that the year was 2009. He had the research he had my sister who made him think there were reasons he really needed to fear for my life. And he did everything he could to help me within a system that felt impossible. So I see all the good intentions there. And we had a very interesting interaction when the book was going to come out, because I emailed him and I said, I love to use your real name because I see you as a hero in this story. But I want you to know that later on, a different medical opinion will kind of say everything that you did was wrong. And I just want to see if you want your actual name used or not. And he actually did want his real name used. You can look him up. His name is Dr. Samir Oza. And I think he still stands behind what he did and is able to really understand the full context of everything. What I am frustrated by now, so after the wire snapped in Tucson, because at the time there was only one insurer on the Pima County marketplace, there were only 2 cardiology offices I could have gone to. They have since merged, by the way, which is very disturbing to me. I no longer live there, but now I would have no other options. But I've tried to move to the other office in town, and the electrophysiologist there refused to write me an out-of-network authorization to continue working with the Mayo Clinic because he didn't believe I needed it. He felt like he was a perfectly fine care. And I know it can be very, it's a little bit of a measuring contest, like, is Dr. Ackerman that much better a physician than him? And it's like, well, yeah, he's the world's expert on QT syndrome. And like, yeah, the cardiac surgeons take nests of wire out of people's heart, if not on a regular basis, more often than anyone else. And like, it makes sense for me to have my care managed by specialists. So he really blocked me. And I also said that I wasn't going to get a new defibrillator the next time it ran out, and I wanted to have it out. And he said he refused. And if we took a survey of all cardiologists, electrophysiologists, how many do you think would say you need a defibrillator? Most of them. And that's because of the way the standards are written. There's a sort of point system for like, do you have family members who've gone down? What is the actual number on your QT interval? How long is it? You know, so when you add up my points, I am the case that's kind of on the edge, but I fall in the category of giver and ICD, the way things are written now. And all of that is just a little slow to catch up with the research that's happening at the top tier institution. So whether it's about ego or whether it's about this trickling down of the newest research into the way that most cardiologists are practicing, what is my frustration now is really much more around cardiologists who are not going to honor my own autonomy and sovereignty in saying that I don't want this device anymore, that I'm more afraid of the long-term impacts of the technology and the way it impacts my life, the way it impacts my ability to live a life that feels like being alive, which is my real goal. Mm-hmm. That's what I want to attend to. I want to be in the American healthcare system as little as possible. We can't always avoid it, but if I'm more worried about the technology than the heart condition, we have a problem.
Yes. There's one last question, and I see the time, so it's up to you, Katie, if you want to take one last question. It's
Sure, absolutely.
okay, great. Holly's asking, have you spent time grieving? And if so, what resources, if any, have you used that have helped or supported or guided you?
That's really wonderful, Holly. Thank you. You know, I think I really got robbed of a lot of grieving time because of being the only person I knew going through it in this way, and the only young person I knew. I didn't have other young friends who were dealing with serious illness or death. I didn't find my way to a therapist until until after the wire snap. That was really what broke my nervous system so fully that I couldn't work anymore. I couldn't get things done. My life started falling apart. And so one of my main recommendations for the system has a lot to do with how we intervene and show people resources and catch them and provide the right people in the right places, because my parents weren't going to be the ones to hold space for me around my almost dying. My partner ended up breaking up with me right after I got out of the hospital from sepsis. And so I do think I partially mourned my youth and innocence in mourning him, in sort of seeing how a young relationship couldn't hold up to these themes that most people don't have to engage with until much later in life. And when I was writing the book, I really did a lot of trauma therapy, somatic experiencing, EMDR, body work, just a lot of practices and working with practitioners who could hold me. And so I think that's when I did a lot of the grieving around this. But I will also say, there's some of that work that really still needs to be done that I didn't realize until I was really on the first section of book tour in 2020 virtually. I would be talking about my own wire in my chest in relationship to death kind of all day long, and it was not good for me. And realizing as I watched my experiences shock people at a different level, it was like, oh, there's really quite a bit here. And so my next book is, it's going to be called Skin Hunger, and it's about how I've been single for my entire adult life, other than that one relationship. And there are a lot of reasons for that. You know, this is a book about sexuality and abstinence culture and technology. Again, it's about a lot of things, but one of the things that I think I'm still really working to grieve is the way becoming a person who knows about these things, and particularly a woman who knows about death and illness in this way, and who spends her life writing about it, talking about it, studying it, how that makes me very intimidating or inaccessible to a lot of men my age, and what it has meant to be alone through certain experiences. Not alone entirely, because I've had amazing parents and amazing communities, but alone romantically, and having to hold myself on certain nights and through certain phone calls, and really understanding that there's kind of a limited amount of that you can do before the grief of that really takes you under. And that's why I have to write a book about it, because I'm built to be a person who only survives things if I use the thing itself as a life raft.
Amen. Yes to all that you've just said. I remember so often being at parties where people, my friends my age would be like in one room, and I'd be in the back room with their widowed parents, like talking about the grief of their death.
Right.
Christmas, New Year's parties, and me, and I was 34, 35,
Yeah.
whatever.
I spent my first year of grad school at the Death Cafe. I was 26.
Yes. Perfect. Yes. So my personal belief is that people should start doing that when, right out of the womb. But since that's not really our culture, it is hard. I was one of several facilitators for a young adults group at a place that it was in Marin. It was called the Center for Attitudinal Healing. And it was a remarkable place. A psychiatrist named Jerry Jampowski started it really for his own healing. And he started with a group of young children. This was sort of channeled to him. He was having a lot of issues himself, and he sort of got this download of information that he should just set up a group of terminally ill children and observe them for a year.
Wow.
And then take whatever he learned and offer that to other people, which is what he did. And the Center for Attitudinal Healing grew out of this. And for part of my life, for a number of 4 or 5 years, I was a co-facilitator for a group of young adults so they were between 12, 13, maybe 13, 14, and 20 that were living with life-threatening illness. And they were remarkable teachers, really, to me and for all of us that were in that group. And most of them have died, but they were also in this very isolated situation because their high school or early college friends were like, yeah, no, just like, so we had an annual dance and they named it the Black and Blue Ball. There was a very famous black and white ball that was super fancy in San Francisco. And they're like, yeah, we got that. We got the Black and Blue Ball. And it was a fantastic, it was just so great. It was just such a wonderful, because they would say, thank God we can talk about this. Like, I know I'm going to die from this, but I can't like go home and say to my parents who are sitting in the next room, like crying their eyeballs out.
That's right.
Like, I can't be honest about this with my parents because they can't handle it. But I need a place to say, like, I'm 16 and I know I'm going to die from AIDS, one of the guys had. And so how am I going to navigate this? He had a blood transfer for some other illness, so it was just such an isolating experience. And it broke my heart when the center closed. Because young adults in particular, I think there's no place for them to go for support like this, where they can have these conversations about, I haven't, been on a date and I'm in 12th grade, or, but all of those
And it needs to be structured in everywhere. You can't just give a kid a diagnosis and even if they're going to survive, right? Or you assume they will, like with diabetes. When I was given Coumadin, everybody in my care thought I was going to survive. That's why they weren't worried about giving me Coumadin. But for them to recognize that I didn't think that I would, and that my sense of who I was and what the world was had so changed, that deserves space. That's a relationship to death, even in aliveness. And we have to figure out what some of those points of catching and holding are.
Absolutely.
Catching, holding, connecting.
Yes, all of those things. Well, Katie, I want to just thank you on behalf of myself and also the Elisabeth Kübler-Ross Foundation for being with us tonight. And I am going to close the official part of this out. I'm going to put up, there's a place if anybody's interested. We offer these programs at no cost. And if people would like to make a donation to the foundation, that is very helpful. Some people are sending me direct messages, but a number of them are thanking you, Katie, here in the chat. And this is, I'm going to ask Ken to put this up on the YouTube channel as quickly as he can, Katie. I'll send you that information. You're welcome to use that recording. And then I'll also send out an email with all the resources for how to keep in touch with Katie, her Patreon page, how to get the book, and her website. So thank you all so much. I'm going to turn off the recording now, and then I'm going to stay for a couple of minutes if anybody else would like to just stay. I do need to go in about 10 minutes, though. Thank you all.
Thank you, everyone, for being here. It's such a treat.
Thank you.